On a dark night in 1941, a lone German fighter plane screamed across the Scottish sky and crashed into a farm field. The pilot bailed out, landing with a broken ankle and a secret that would baffle the world for decades. This pilot was no ordinary airman. He was the Deputy Führer of Nazi Germany, the man who sat at Hitler's right hand. Yet, within hours, his own government called him insane. The British threw him in a cell, and he began a 46-year journey into total isolation. This is the story of Rudolf Hess, the prisoner who knew too much. Long before he fell from the sky, Rudolf Hess was the most loyal follower Adolf Hitler ever had. They met in 1920, and Hess was instantly captivated. When Hitler was thrown into Landsberg prison after a failed coup in 1923, Hess went with him voluntarily. In that small cell, he took dictation for the book that would become the blueprint for horror, Mein Kampf. Hess was more than a secretary. He was a true believer who worshipped Hitler as a messiah. For years, he introduced the Führer at massive rallies, his eyes wide with fanaticism. He became the Deputy Führer, a title that sounded powerful. But in reality, he was becoming a mascot. As he waved to crowds, other men like Martin Bormann were quietly stealing his actual power and pushing Hess to the sidelines. By 1941, Rudolf Hess was desperate. The war was expanding, and he knew plans were in motion to invade the Soviet Union. Hess believed fighting Britain was a mistake. He thought the two nations should be allies rather than enemies. He convinced himself that if he could just talk to the right people in England, he could stop the war in the West and regain his status as Hitler's favorite. He spent months training in secret, modifying a Messerschmitt Bf 110 fighter plane with extra fuel tanks. He studied maps of Scotland and learned the route to the home of the Duke of Hamilton, a man he wrongly believed would listen to him. On May 10, 1941, he wrote a final letter to Hitler, put on a leather flying suit, and took off alone into the night. The flight was a technical masterpiece, but the arrival was a disaster. Hess ran out of fuel over Scotland and had to bail out, leaving his plane to crash into a bonfire of twisted metal. He landed heavily in a field near Eaglesham and broke his ankle. A local ploughman named David McLean heard the noise and ran out with a pitchfork. He found a man lying in the grass, groaning in pain. Hess gave a fake name, Alfred Horn, and said he had a message for the Duke of Hamilton. McLean had no idea he was looking at the Deputy Führer of the Third Reich. He simply helped the injured German into his cottage, and his mother offered the enemy pilot a cup of tea. It was a bizarre, quiet moment before the storm of history broke over them. When the letter Hess left behind reached Adolf Hitler, the reaction was explosive. The Führer let out a scream that was heard through the Berghof. He immediately realized how bad this looked. If Hess made a deal, it was treason. If he failed, it was an embarrassment. Hitler did not wait to find out. He ordered the German press to announce that Hess had gone insane, suffering from hallucinations and a mental derangement. In a single day, Hess went from being the second most important man in Germany to a non-existent lunatic. His photos were removed from offices, and his name was banned. Meanwhile, in Britain, Winston Churchill visited the prisoner. He realized Hess was neither a master spy nor a peace envoy with real authority. He was merely a discarded relic of a regime that had moved on without him. The British moved Hess to a secure location in Surrey called Mitchett Place, which they codenamed Camp Z. The arrangement resembled a spy novel. The house was bugged with microphones in the walls, the fireplaces, and even the garden. Intelligence officers watched his every move, trying to uncover secrets he might be hiding. However, Hess was falling apart. He became convinced his food was poisoned. He would swap plates with his guards at the last second to test them. His paranoia grew so severe that he once threw himself over a stairwell railing in a desperate suicide attempt, only to break his leg again. For the rest of the war, the Deputy Führer sat in a room in England, wrapping bits of food in paper to save as evidence of the poison he believed was everywhere. In 1945, the war ended, and Hess was sent to Nuremberg to face justice alongside the surviving Nazi leaders. The man who sat in the dock seemed vacant. He told the court he could not remember anything. He did not know who Göring was. He did not remember his role in the party, and he claimed he had no memory of the flight to Scotland. The other defendants were annoyed by his behavior as he sat in court reading novels or staring blankly at the ceiling. Suddenly, he stood up and announced his amnesia had been a trick all along. He declared his devotion to Hitler one last time, although others were sentenced to hang. The judges decided Hess's crimes merited a different punishment, which was life imprisonment. He would never walk free again. Hess was transferred to Spandau Prison in West Berlin, a massive red brick fortress built to hold 600 inmates. By this time, it held only 7. These were the Spandau Seven, the high-ranking Nazis who avoided execution. The prison was run by the 4 Allied powers of America, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, who took turns guarding it 1 month at a time. The rules were strict. The prisoners were called by numbers rather than names. Hess was number 7. They were forbidden from talking about the war or their past glory. Although other prisoners like Albert Speer tried to cope by gardening or writing secret memoirs, Hess remained stubborn. He refused to work, complained constantly about his health, and demanded respect he no longer commanded. He was the most difficult prisoner of them all. Time began to empty the cells of Spandau. Some prisoners were released early due to poor health. Others served their full terms and walked out the heavy iron gates. By October 1966, Albert Speer and Baldur von Schirach were released, leaving Rudolf Hess completely alone. He was now the sole inhabitant of a prison designed for hundreds. For the next 20 years, the routine of this massive complex revolved entirely around one old man. The silence in the cell block was heavy. There were no more arguments with other Nazis and no more shared meals. Only Hess, the guards, and the echo of his own footsteps remained. He had become a living ghost, trapped in a Cold War relic that the world was trying to forget. The situation at Spandau became absurd. To guard this one fragile old man, the 4 powers maintained a staff of nearly 100 people. There were cooks, waiters, cleaners, and 40 soldiers on constant rotation. The cost was incredibly high, running into hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, all paid for by the West German government. Every month, a formal changing of the guard ceremony took place outside the gates, with marching bands and military salutes, all for a prison with a population of 1. Western governments began to suggest that it was time to let him go. He was in his 80s, harmless and frail. Whenever the subject of release arose, the answer from one side was a hard no. The Soviet Union refused to show mercy. For them, Rudolf Hess was more than an old man. He was a symbol of the regime that had devastated their country. There was also a colder, more political reason for keeping him locked up. Spandau Prison was located in the British sector of West Berlin. As long as Hess was there, the Soviets had a legal right to send their troops into the western sector to guard him. It was their only foothold in West Berlin. If Hess was released or died, the prison would close, and they would lose that access. So, the Soviets insisted he serve his full life sentence. Hess became a pawn in the Cold War, kept alive and imprisoned not just for his crimes, but for a loophole in a treaty. Day after day, Hess followed a rigid routine. He woke early, ate simple meals, and watched television, though news programs were strictly censored to prevent him from seeing anything about himself or the modern neo-Nazi movement. His only real freedom was in the prison garden. He was allowed to walk there every day, and over the years, he wore a path into the grass. He became obsessed with the moon and covered his cell walls with lunar maps. The guards, many of whom were young enough to be his grandsons, found him to be a strange, grumpy figure. He was not the monster they expected, but rather a shuffling old man in a frayed coat who demanded they address him properly. He seemed determined to outlive them all. On August 17, 1987, the routine finally broke. Hess was 93 years old. After lunch, he went for his usual walk in the garden and entered a small summer house, a construction trailer that had been converted into a reading room. He was alone. A short time later, a guard looked in and found Hess slumped over. An electrical extension cord from a reading lamp was wrapped around his neck and tied to a window latch. Despite frantic attempts to revive him at a British military hospital, he was pronounced dead. The official verdict was suicide by asphyxiation. After 46 years in captivity, the last of the Spandau Seven had finally escaped. Almost immediately, the official story was challenged. Hess's son, Wolf Rudiger Hess, claimed his father had been murdered. He argued that the old man was too frail to tie a knot or hang himself. He pointed out that Hess had recently told his lawyer he expected to be released soon due to shifting Soviet policies, which might have panicked British intelligence. The theory was that the British killed him to prevent him from revealing embarrassing wartime secrets if he ever walked free. Although official autopsies confirmed suicide, the lack of a public inquiry fueled conspiracy theories for decades. To this day, some believe agents entered the garden that afternoon to silence the prisoner forever. The strangest theory concerned his identity rather than his death. For years, a persistent rumor claimed the man in Spandau was not Rudolf Hess at all. The theory suggested the real Hess had been shot down in 1941 or murdered secretly, and an impostor had taken his place to serve the life sentence. Proponents pointed to physical differences and the fact that Prisoner 7 refused to see his family for 28 years. This sounded like fiction, but serious historians investigated it. If true, it meant an innocent double had spent half a century rotting in jail while the world watched. This mystery hung over his grave for nearly 30 years after his death. In 2019, science resolved the mystery. Researchers at the University of Salzburg published the results of a DNA test comparing a blood sample from the prisoner with a living relative of Hess. The result was a 99.99% match. There was no double. The man who sat in that cell for 46 years was indeed Rudolf Hess. By then, Spandau Prison itself was long gone. Immediately after his death, the entire fortress was demolished and crushed into powder to prevent it from becoming a neo-Nazi shrine. The rubble was dumped in the North Sea. Even his grave in Wunsiedel was dug up in 2011, his bones cremated and scattered, leaving no physical trace of the man. Rudolf Hess ended his life as a man without a grave, without a prison, and without a legacy. He began as a powerful figure who helped build a nightmare, and ended as a lonely old man in a garden, guarding secrets that didn't matter anymore. His flight to Scotland remains one of the strangest chapters of World War II, a moment where history paused in uncertainty. Today, a shopping center stands where Spandau Prison used to be, burying the memory of the last prisoner under concrete and commerce.